left off around international trade, which is a balance of trade, which is a ratio between how much is exported and how much is imported. I know I went over this last time already, but just to give a preview before we start things, just wanted to refresh what we did last time. So we left off with balance of trade, positive and negative balance. So positive balance is exports over imports. So exports is anything that the country is selling to another country, whereas import is anything that the country is buying from another country. And then, so this is a positive balance of trade, right? Then a negative balance of trade would be if instead of it being that way where exports are more than imports, it goes in within the opposite direction, right? It goes in the opposite direction where the number of imports is larger than the number of exports. So for all countries, you want to be able to have a positive balance of trade, and you want to prevent a negative balance of trade because you don't want too much of your currency to be in other countries. So you want to be the country that's doing business. You want to be the one who's making money, and you don't want to have the other countries making money from you. And now, okay, next slide. So we already went over the tenets of business, which is how exactly you do business and what are some business ideas. But there is a new section on business, which is business law, which is how to use those tactics legally without being arrested, without committing crimes, because you can't really make money when you're in prison. So you have to know how to be able to make money, but not make them so illegally that you would actually get into legal trouble. So firstly, what are the types of laws that there are? So the first type is common law. So a common law is basically the most basic type of law there is, well, as shown by the name common law. It's based on previous court decisions. So what does that mean? That basically means that the way that our courts make decisions right now could impact the decisions that are made in the future. And the reason behind this is because if you're making a decision within a court, then you're setting a precedent, which is an example, a model, well, hopefully a model if you're making a right decision according to the Constitution. But you're basically paving the path for what future courts will do and what future judges will do. So this is common law. And not many people know this, but actually a lot of our basic laws are basically just based off of court decisions that were made previously that have become basically universally accepted. So if this judge makes a decision, for example, and everyone liked this decision, right? Then this would become common law. So common law is basically just a written version, the recorded version of that court decision right there. And the second type of law, more complicated, is statutory law. So statutory law is more permanent. It's way more permanent than common law. So statutory law will be, it's not just a regular law, it's some kind of law that has been set in stone already that cannot be changed. Like, for example, the Constitution or individual acts that the government has passed specifically. So let's say if the government decided to pass an act specifically on, let's say, how much ice cream you can sell in a day, right? Because I love ice cream. So this would be an individual act. As you can see, it's targeting a very specific part of business. It's targeting a very specific field. So that means that it's harder to change it because they probably put more effort in making this law because it was important enough for them to make a law just regulating this small decision. So there was probably some kind of background stuff going on for this law to be passed in the first place. And then there are administrative laws. So administrative laws are basically laws that govern a particular, not a particular industry, but a particular way that you're able to do things and go about business. So there are administrative laws for everything. There are administrative laws for things like how much water a company can ship. I don't know what kind of type of things administrative laws are for, but let's say how much a company can produce, a certain type of company can produce, and how much assets they can own. It's literally, as the name suggests, asserting its administration over a specific institution or broader an industry. And the institutions that are putting up these specific laws, administrative laws, are institutions with specific names that regulate a certain part of the world. So, for example, there is the Federal Trade Commission. So, what this means is that just as we talked about specialization in terms of the economy, right? Specialization also exists in terms of law because in the legal field, certain institutions are already responsible for making laws pertaining to a certain field. So, for example, the Federal Trade Commission specializes in lawmaking for trade, as the name would suggest. Now, we already talked about laws, right? So, for laws, if you do not like a law or if you somehow break a law, then where do you go to be able to defend yourself and have your say? You have to go to courts, right? Well, did you know that there were actually three types of courts? Well, there are more than three types of courts, but all the types of courts can be generalized within three categories. And the three categories are trial courts, appellate courts, and supreme courts. So just starting things off with the trial courts. Trial courts are probably the courts that most people will have some experience in. Let's say if you parked incorrectly by accident or maybe on purpose you parked incorrectly. You thought you could get away with it, but you didn't. And then you got summoned to the court, right? Then you would probably be facing a trial court, just the most basic version of a trial court, because as I said, within each of these three categories, there are many different variations of it, right? So trial courts would range from anything from just having you walk through the process, but nothing's really happening, to an actual court where the type of things that you see on TV, where someone gets convicted of a crime and they show up in court. So that's a trial court. It's just the most basic. But then, if the trial court came down with their ruling about whether or not you were guilty or you got or you're not guilty, right? And you didn't like their decision. Well, most likely it's going to be because you were ruled as guilty, but you didn't think you were guilty. Then you actually have a second chance at this. So what you do is you go to the appellate court. The appellate court, as the name says, it's basically a court where you can appeal the previous court's decision. You can complain to the court basically that you weren't being treated fairly, or you thought that they weren't looking at the situation just about from the perspective that they should have looked at it in. So it's for you to appeal to if you didn't like some kind of decision. And then the last type of court is Supreme Court. So this is your last chance. If somehow the court for you to appeal in still did not give you the decision that you would have liked, then you would go to the Supreme Court. As the name suggests, the Supreme Court is the biggest court. It's the most powerful court. The most powerful Supreme Court, the most famous Supreme Court, is the U.S. Federal Supreme Court, located in Washington, D.C. So if you wanted to really have a say, well, if your case qualified, if your case was so big that it actually qualified for the Supreme Court, then you could, in theory, go to Washington, D.C. and argue it out. But that's the constitutional court. So the legal stuff has become so complicated and so high that they have to consult the Constitution to make a ruling. So that just shows how supreme the court is. And there are actually three levels of the Supreme Courts. So there's a local Supreme Court, there's a national, there's a state Supreme Court, and there's a national Supreme Court. So Supreme Courts are not necessarily the most supreme of courts. It's just that compared to the other two, they are the most supreme. Let's say if I lived in a small town, right? First, I will go to the trial court, and then if I didn't like this decision, hopefully I wouldn't have to do this, but if I didn't like the decision, then I will go to the appellate court, and then finally I will go to the Supreme Court to have my final chance. After the Supreme Court, no matter if I liked their decision or not, then I don't have any chances. I just had to accept the ruling. So the first type of law is contract law. So contract laws are basically laws that govern contracts, as the name would suggest. What type of contracts are legal and are actually enforceable by law? Because it's not that you can just give someone a random piece of paper for them to sign and you can actually sue them if they don't do what they say. So every single contract that you put out has to follow these criteria that are below. So the criteria are agreement, consent, capacity, consideration, legality, and proper form. So the first one is agreement. Well, I think this is the most obvious part. If you get someone to sign a contract with you, then the two of you must agree to sign the contract. So you cannot trick them into signing the contract to something that they didn't agree to. So that would not be a legal contract. The second part is consent. Now, on a similar note, they must actually allow you to have this contract with them. They must be willing, they must be voluntarily willing to enter into this contract with you. So that means that you can't force someone to sign a business contract with you. That also would not be a legal contract. And just keep in mind here that when I say it's not a legal contract, it basically means that even if the contract were broken, you cannot sue the other person because the contract is not sanctioned by law. Even if they agreed to the contract, that still does not mean that the contract is valid. And that's the reason why you don't hear about 5-year-olds signing business deals, because they must have the capacity to follow the contract law. I believe, I'm not sure, but I believe most times the age limit for contracts is 18 years old. I think it varies based on the jurisdiction and the type of contract that you're signing, but most times it's 18 years old. So it's not only age for capacity, they also must be able to do what the contract says. So let's say if you had a contract that says that if something happens, someone in the contract has to pay $20,000. So here capacity would mean that number one, that person is above 18, which means that they're able to 18 or above 18, which means that they're able to accept the responsibilities legally of the contract. And then it means that they also must have that $20,000, that amount, that whatever amount of money that the contract says, because someone cannot pay something that's within a contract if they don't have that amount of money, right? So they must be able to fulfill the contract. And now the next one is consideration. So this is a fairly legal term. So within a day-to-day context, within an everyday context, you wouldn't use this word in this connotation, but here legally it means value. So consideration is just another word for value. So all contracts must have something of value that's being exchanged. If you think about possible contract ideas, right? And lastly, legality. So legality means that all steps in the contract must be legal. And lastly, it has to have proper form. So this is the second reason. Another reason why you can't just write out a contract on a piece of paper. So with so many procedures in place, what if someone still decided to violate a contract? What if they still did not fulfill their end of the bargain of the deal? Then you have two options. Number one, you can directly ask them to compensate you for damages. So this means that whatever you lost, they have to pay back to you, usually in the form of money. Most times, the court would or basically hand them a fine that says they have to pay you a certain amount of money for the damages that their actions caused. Well, not their action, but their not fulfilling of the contract cost. And number two, you can just cancel the contract. So you can just say that the contract is non-existent anymore. So the first type is contract law. We already went over that. The second type is tort law. Tort law is basically a French term meaning damages. So tort is this French legal term. But what exactly does it mean? It means that damages that must be compensated for. So what is this? It's basically any type of action that harms another person. But one huge distinction is that this is civil law. This is not criminal law. So that the actions are not quite that bad, but they're so bad because they caused harm to someone. So that means that usually in tort laws, just usually most times, you wouldn't actually go to prison if you violated a tort law. You would just have to pay a huge amount of money. There are three types. So the first type would be intentional. So it would be if you intentionally caused harm to someone. So an example of this would be if you harassed someone, right? I know sometimes harassment could be considered criminal, but on more minor levels, like if you, for example, you went to someone's house to stalk them, that's you're causing them danger and you're causing them fear, right? You're causing them to be uncomfortable, but it's not necessarily illegal. This will be intentional tort because you went to their house, you didn't do it by accident. And the way that they solve for this is firstly, sometimes courts will give compensatory orders to the criminal, the person who's well, not the criminal, the offender of the tort law. So that means that they basically have to pay you a certain amount of money to show that they're sorry, basically, and to compensate for the damages that they caused. The second type, and usually both of these will come together because the court will also have to punish them for the behavior. So not only do they have to pay you for the damages that they caused, they also have to pay a fine for what they did wrong. The second type would be negligence tort. So it would be if they didn't do something on purpose, but their actions still caused damage. So let's say if I were on a train, right? If I were the operator of a train, I accidentally pressed this button, and hopefully this is purely hypothetical. If I accidentally press this button that caused the train to crash into the side of a mountain, then that right there will be the second category, because I didn't press the button on purpose. So I didn't have any malicious intents, any bad ideas, any bad reasons for doing that, right? That would not be intentional, but still caused some lives to be lost, some injuries, some financial losses. The train was damaged as a result of my negligence. And the last type, this one is the most specific. It's product tort. So it's basically when a manufacturer sells a product that causes damage, because selling a defective product isn't necessarily criminal. It could be if you do it under a set of specific circumstances and you cause too many lives to be lost and too many deaths and too much harms. But if you just accidentally produce this product that had some kind of thing that caused danger to consumers, then you wouldn't be doing that on purpose. So it's not criminal and it's not bad. So you wouldn't be committing a crime, but you're still doing something wrong that you have to be punished and you have to be causing damage and you have to compensate those damages. So this would also be a tort. So the next type of law is property law. So property law basically governs ownership. So what does it mean exactly from a legal perspective to own something? And I'm not just talking about owning like small things like pencils, right? I'm talking about big things that you actually care about. What does it mean to own things? Things that are big enough that they're important enough to be governed by law. So there are four types of ownerships that you can have, the four types of relationships you can have with actual objects. Tangible real property. So tangible real property is land and anything on top of it. So your house would be tangible real property because it's this structure that you have, right? So this will be tangible real property. The next type is tangible personal property. So tangible personal properties are basically things that can be moved and sold. So for example, it would be your car will be a tangible personal property. And I know these terms are complicated, but these are weird uses of the words. And this is the thing with these legal terms, is that sometimes tweaking a tiny bit of a legal term can make it can make the phrase have an entirely different meaning. Yeah, so this is just something with legal terms, but don't worry if you can't remember these terms. Just know what types of ownership exist and worry about the terms later. So, for example, it will be your car because it can be moved and sold, but it's still something that's important. There's intangible personal property. So, intangible personal properties are more abstract. So, there are things that cannot be seen. So, for example, stocks, right? So, stocks will be intangible personal property because you own the stocks, but you can't actually see the stocks. Well, you can see the chart, but they won't give you a piece of paper that says stocks and the amount that you bought, the amount of shares you bought, right? So, but it's still your property. So that would be intangible personal property. And then the last type is actually really closely related to intangible personal property. It's intellectual property. So intellectual property, it's basically the ideas of someone. And this is the reason why plagiarism is a bad thing. And they say plagiarism is basically stealing because the ideas that you're taking are actually ideas, are actually property, just as much as they're all a house, right? You wouldn't steal someone's house. So you wouldn't steal someone's idea either. And you could actually get into real legal trouble for stealing someone's houses. This includes things like books and movies. So it's anything that someone created. And now let's move on to protecting ideas. So how exactly do we protect intellectual property? So the first way to protect intellectual property is through copyright. And copyright exists for 70 years after the author or the maker or whatever of the idea or the inventor of the idea dies. And you can basically understand it as the person basically has the ownership of the idea for their entire life. And what does this mean? This basically means that anyone who uses the idea has to consult with them and have to pay them a certain amount of money. Well, if you got permission to not pay money, then you don't have to pay. But most authors would require a fee. So you would have to pay them a certain amount of fee to be able to reproduce their work. And the next type will be a trademark. So a trademark will be a name. Yes, you can own a name, and this is not just. I know it sounds cool if you can say, "Oh, I'm the only person in the world who has some kind of name," right? But this is for bigger companies and basically brand names that we all know. For example, Walmart, Costco, right? These brand names. And believe it or not, you actually can't copy their name. And your name can't be too similar to theirs either. There are tons of legal loopholes when doing this, where you see designs where some companies change one letter, and yes, but the name cannot be too similar to the original name. Don't ask me how they managed to start a brand by changing only one letter, but they definitely use some kind of legal loophole that prevents them just from just taking the name. Because number one, it wouldn't be fair to the original company because they were the one who came up with the name. And secondly, it wouldn't be good for consumers either because it's going to be confusing if every single company had, hey, that name is a good idea. So guess what? I'm gonna name my company that name too. That will be too confusing for shoppers. But the thing with trademarks, it's not written here, but actually trademarks only last for 20 years. So after 20 years, if you don't reapply for your trademark, then if you decide to abandon it, then anyone could use your name. And until someone applied for it again, or you applied for it, there will be these restrictions again. But before that, everyone could use your name. For, so the last time will be a patent. So a patent is basically an exclusive use of a product idea. It's basically intellectual property except used for an invention. So let's say if you invented something, right? Or you don't necessarily have to invent something. It's basically just the business version of intellectual property. The idea of this object rests with you. That object is yours. The blueprint of that object is yours. So no one can produce it in the exact same way as you do unless you give them permission, or you give them permission and they paid you a certain amount of money. Now, you may be asking, well, why can't someone just patent, for example, water, right? Or oxygen. Think about it. If they put a patent over water, then or oxygen, then every single person would have to pay them every single time they used that product, right? Well, not the consumers, but every single company that needs oxygen and every single company that needs water would have to pay them, right? Well, this is because there are actually limits over what you can patent. So it has to be novel. So that means that it has to be new. It has to be something that wasn't existing before you came along. And secondly, it has to be useful. So there actually has to be a use to the object. So I can't just invent some kind of a random machine and try to patent it. And lastly, it has to be non-obvious, which means that you actually have had to put effort to make the object. We went over property law already, right? But property law is not absolute. It protects your property to a relatively safe degree, but it doesn't mean that you're actually safe from everything. So there are two circumstances that your property loss could be violated legally without you being able to do anything. So the first type would be basically an eminent domain. So what's eminent domain? It sounds complicated. It's basically when if the government can basically seize your land basically, but they can't just take your land because they want it to. Well, we should be grateful that the law says that. But if they need to use your land for some kind of public work, for example, if they were building a railway or a canal or a dam or an airport, then they would be able to take your property away from you, so that they're able to build over your land. Well, obviously, a lot of times, hopefully, on all of the times, it's going to come with some kind of compensation, but the government sometimes their compensation policies are a tiny bit controversial because there are many ways to assess the value of a home and the damages that they're causing by building over your home, right? So a lot of times the person living without a home, the previous owner of the home may not actually be satisfied with the amount of compensation that they were granted. So this brings us back to our early idea. Remember when I said that economics ideas were all somewhat interconnected? So if you don't like the conversation that you're being presented, then you can go to the course and you can level up to try to get more compensation, or you can even try to stop the government from doing whatever project that they're doing, but obviously. And a less extreme version are companies. So these are just individual companies, and hopefully the companies are not too extreme with this. And the companies are less powerful than the government, right? At least in most countries they are. So they can do less, but they can still infringe your property rights sometimes. And these two are all about the first type of property, which is tangible real property, because these are the only two that there would actually be a justifiable reason for violating. So there are companies that serve an entire community. For example, water company was building a pipe through your neighborhood, right? then the water company would technically be able to dig under your land to put the water pipes there, because these laws, they don't really apply to these companies that serve an entire community. Because if you refuse to allow the construction companies to put pipes under your land, then you're negatively impacting the entire community, because pipes have to run through somewhere, right? The last idea that I hope to cover was agency law. So basically, an agent is anyone who represents someone else within a business environment. So a lot of times you hear about agents for buying a house, right? The agents are basically hired by the house selling company to represent them in front of the customers. So that's the reason why they're called agents. And of course, agents must have authority to operate, right? You can't sell houses if you're not allowed to have access to those houses that you're selling. It doesn't mean you're able to live in the houses, but it just means that you're able to have information, and you're able to have the personal informations of the of the people who already live inside the house. And there are three ways that authority can be given to an agent. So firstly, it can be directly expressed, which means that the company basically says to the agent, okay, I give you authority. The second, that could be apparent or implied. So implied could be basically within a context where a person with decent amount of common sense would tell that the agent has already received authority. Although no one actually officially declared it, but they still have authority. And the last type will be apparent. So apparent would be you can already see that they have authority. Now, just one thing to be clear: the principal is still responsible for the action that the agent commits, even though the agent could face punishments for what they do. But the principal is still responsible. And this is the example why it's important when you're starting a business to hire good people, right? Because you would still be responsible for what your employees do wrong, the crimes that they commit. So who's the principal? The principal is basically the boss of the agent, the person who's giving the permission to the agent to operate. And that's just our last idea for this class. Good night, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.